Let's start out by making the API that we want to have exist, and then we'll go ahead and build that API. So what we want to be able to do is have a modal component, and inside of that modal component, we want to have a control for the open button. So we'll have a modal open button, and inside of that is the button that we want to use for opening this particular modal, which is right here. So we'll copy and paste that right there. And then we want to have a modal contents component. And here we're going to want an ARIA label, which we have right there. So we'll copy that. And that'll be helpful for screen readers. And then here's the contents of our form, which we can come up here and grab right here. So that's our close button. Here's our title and the actual login form. So we'll copy all of that right there. And this is the close button, but we don't want to have to worry about that state that's being managed for us. So we're going to wrap this inside our modal dismiss button component that we'll make. And then for our login on submit, that's going to be this login function. And the submit button is this submit button that we've got right there. And then for our title, that's this login right here. And then we won't need this onClick anymore because our modal dismiss button will handle that for us. So this is the API that we want to have exist. Let's make this API. We need a modal open button, modal contents, and modal dismiss button. So let's come up here and we'll import those as if they exist today. And we'll import them from components modal. So we'll get modal dismiss button, modal contents, and modal open button. Great, so now let's build those components. So we'll import React from React, and we'll import dialog from lib. And this dialog is simply the reach dialog that we get from Reach UI, and it's just been styled with emotion to have the styles that we want. So we're going to be building our own modal API on top of Reach dialog. Great, so let's make a function for modal, and this modal is going to be managing our state. And the state we're managing is open. And we'll have set is open, we'll initialize this to false. And then we'll need to render something here, I'm not sure what yet, but let's make the rest of our components. So we'll need a modal dismiss button, and this is going to accept children, but part of the API is just to accept a single child. So I'm going to alias this to child, just to communicate that to people reading this code. And somehow this needs to get the set is open to toggle that to false. And we need to take that child button and set its onClick to set that is open to false. Let's deal with that later. We're also going to need a modal open button that will operate in a very similar manner. And then finally a modal contents, which is ultimately going to be responsible for rendering the dialog. And we'll take all the props that we get from this and forward those along to the dialog. Specifically, the ARIA label and the children. Great, so how are we going to communicate between the modal and its compound component children? This modal contents needs to know whether to pass is open to the dialog, and the dialog also has an onDismiss prop that it's going to need to use to close the modal. And we want to be able to do all of this while implicitly sharing the state between each of these components so that users of our components don't have to worry about passing that state around to these different components. So the way we're going to do that is with a modal context. We'll use this with React create context, and then our modal, which is responsible for managing the state, can share that state implicitly by rendering a modal context provider. And the modal will just accept all the props and forward them along right here. And we do need to spell this with the same casing, otherwise it won't work. And we'll provide the value as an array of is open and set is open. Now that means we can get set is open from React use context, modal context, and we can do the same in our modal open button. And then down here, we can get the is open and set is open from that context as well. And we'll pass is open as a prop here. And then on dismiss, we'll pass a function that calls set is open to false. Great. So then for these buttons here, we're going to accept that child button, and we're going to return React clone element child. We'll make a copy of that button, and we'll give it a prop called onClick. And that onClick will be a function where we call setIsOpen to false. And we'll do a very similar thing for our modal open button, except we'll set it to true. So now this modal is implicitly sharing this state between all of its compound components using React context, so consumers of the modal components don't have to know anything about the context and state that's being shared between all of these components. So we're almost done. All we need to do now is export the modal dismiss button, the modal open button, and the modal contents. And let's see if that works. So we've got a couple extra buttons here. Let's go back to our unauthenticated app and we'll remove the login form for the login button there. And now we have a single login that's powered by our new modal and a register that's powered by the old abstraction. So if I click login, we can say ABC and our password, and the whole login works just as well as it had before. Now we can take this more powerful, more flexible abstraction and use it for registration as well. So on submit will be register, the modal title will be register, our modal label text is going to be registration form, our submit button is going to be this secondary register button, and our open button will be this secondary register button. Then we can get rid of that, save this, and it looks like registration works just as well. Yep, there we go. So things are looking great, and now we can get rid of this entire abstraction right here. And let's just take a look at this. I see 2 bits of code that are pretty similar between these two. So one other thing I'm going to do is I'm going to grab this and make a React element called circle dismiss button. And then we'll just insert that where it was before. And we'll do the same with this one, because those 2 bits of code are exactly the same. It doesn't need to be parameterized, so I don't need to make a component out of it. I'm just fine creating a single element and sharing it between both of those. So I'm feeling pretty happy with this abstraction because it's nice and declarative, meaning that I can totally control the contents, I can totally control the open button, and it's generic enough to be useful throughout my application. So let's review how we made this abstraction. Here we made a modal context, and that's how we implicitly share some state between all of these modal components. The modal is responsible for rendering that context provider and providing that value to all of the modal's compound components, and those children components consume that context and grab the piece of that context value that they need to do their job. The dismiss button and open button have an API that accepts a single child and makes a copy of that child, setting the onClick prop to update that is open state that is implicitly shared from the modal component. And then our modal contents component is the one that's responsible for rendering the reach UI dialog. It forwards along the is open state, and it also handles the onDismiss callback to update the state that's been implicitly shared.